Good evening and welcome. My name is Brian Barr, and I am the Director of Horticulture at Hillwood Estate Museum and Gardens. It is my pleasure to welcome you all to the third of our Great Homes and Garden lecture series. I'd like to give a special welcome to those of you joining us in the simulcast at CW Post. Before we continue, please take a moment to make sure that your phones are silenced. I'd like to thank Sotheby's TTR International Realty for their sponsorship of this month's series. Tonight we escape Washington's dreary, thank you. Tonight we escape Washington's dreary February, or freezing, whatever you want to say, for the sunny Miami as we hear about Vizcaya. If you haven't yet taken advantage of a chance to explore Hillwood's newest exhibition, Splendor and Surprise, Elegant Containers, Antique to Modern, I urge you to come back again soon to do so. If you're not already a member, please consider joining for free admission and discounts in the shop and at programs. Whether you're a member or not, I also want to invite you all to join Hillwood's mailing list and follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Pinterest. It's now my pleasure to introduce tonight's speaker. Ian Simpkins is Chief Horticulturist at Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. He holds a BS in Horticulture from NC State University, and his tenure in public horticulture covers almost 20 years and 5 hardiness zones. He is responsible for developing and overseeing the museum's horticulture and urban agriculture programs, including restoration and interpretation of the gardens and natural areas. Prior to his appointment at Vizcaya in June 2007, Mr. Simpkins held the position of Executive Director at Shofuso Japanese House and Garden in Philadelphia. He has served on the boards of the Tropical Arborist Guild, Greater Philadelphia Gardens, is a recipient of the Chanticleer Foundation and the J.C. Ralston Fellowships, and is currently Vice Chair of the Historic Landscape Section of the American Public Gardens Association and serves on the Horticulture Advisory Committee of the Campan National Tropical Botanic Garden. Please join me in welcoming Ian Simpkins.
Thanks, Brian. I always love it when people call me Mr. Simpkins. It makes me feel so official. And, don't let all of those, official titles and everything scare you away. I'm actually sort of a nice guy. I have to start with an apology, I fear. I really tried to bring the warm weather with me up from Miami. I had to go to Seattle first for a Mahonia conference, and I didn't have enough outstanding balance on my credit card to get it to DC. So unfortunately, I had to leave it in Seattle, which is where it is now. So my apologies for that. But tonight, I'm going to talk about a subject that is really near and dear to my heart, having been there for almost 8 years now, and that's Vizcaya Museum and Gardens. I was speaking to some of you earlier during the meet and greet, or as my grandfather used to call it, the mix and mangle, and was made aware that several of you have actually been to Vizcaya. So that's great to hear, and hopefully the photos that you see tonight are better than what it looked like when you were there. If they are, that means I'm doing my job well. So tonight we're going to go over the history of Vizcaya. I'm going to go into some detail about how it was created, and give you guys a little bit of the Vizcaya gossip. There's some internal stuff that I put in here that I thought was kind of juicy and fun, and wanted to sort of dish a little bit and make it fabulous. But I was wrapping this lecture up as I was looking at the weather forecast and kind of realized that it was going to be inhuman here. So at the end of the lecture, I put in sort of a rapid fire series of beauty shots to maybe get you guys warmed up for the cold drive home. So, you know, Vizcaya is really an amazing, amazing place. There are very few places like it in the country. And really, when you look at how it was created out of this sort of rancid tropical swamp, there's really very few places like it in the world. And it really is magic. And there's no way that these pictures can possibly convey what it actually was and what it is today. But I'm going to attempt to do that tonight. Now, when the Vizcaya property was purchased, it was purchased in several transactions from Mary Brickell. Now, Mary Brickell is known to us Miami locals, if you will, as the founding mother of Miami. And Miami is the only major city in the United States that was actually founded by a woman who happened to be Australian. I can't quite figure that out, but it worked, and here we are, so we'll. But she and her husband, William Brickell, who was a former gold rush magnate and one of Dade County's first commissioners, were very prominent landowners in early Miami when it was a very, very small city. And Mary had the interesting belief that no one in Miami should own more than 250 feet of waterfront. Sounds very egalitarian, right? Well, consider that she owned probably a half mile of waterfront. You know, her motives became pretty clear. But James Deering, who was Vizcaya's patron, who we'll go into a little bit more detail in a minute, was able to finagle Vizcaya's 150 acres from her by purchasing a little bit at a time. So around 1910, 1911, he had purchased the full 150 acres at what he considered to be a flagrant holdup, which was $1,000 per acre. Yeah, I wish I was there then. But, you know, this was prime Miami land, even though it was still wilderness. Miami was a very small city at that time. And F. Burrell Hoffman, who was Vizcaya's architect, wrote down his first impressions of Vizcaya as a long white ribbon through a tunnel of green, which is what you see here. This was the original roadbed of South Miami Avenue, which is now a 4-lane highway from downtown Miami into Coconut Grove. The site contained some of the finest hardwood hammock in the Miami area, which was a fondness of James Deering's. He really liked trees, and he especially liked large old trees, and this hammock contained quite a few of those. And so because of those trees, he chose to locate his house and gardens here, in a mangrove swamp and a tidal grassland swamp. This is what would become the formal gardens. And then further back there, where you see the mangrove forest there, that was all going to be developed later and created into this amazing series of canals and islands, and just the most amazing place that you could possibly imagine. So on to James Deering. I mean, Vizcaya is James Deering, really. He was the person who provided all the funding for it. In the end, it ended up becoming the product of his designers and his architects, and really kind of got out of his grasp. But he was the one that had all the money. He was one of 3 children of William Deering, who founded the Deering Harvester Company. And he was a very worldly and very educated man who supposedly spoke 4 languages with ease: Italian, French, German, and English. He did go to MIT, but he later dropped out, eschewing the academic life for working in his father's company. James then oversaw all of the business operations and the operations management of the Deering Harvester Company, and he really took an active role in inventing. I'm gonna move that this way because I'm gonna knock it out of the park. And I don't want to destroy anything that I would have to pay for later. But he really began to operate in his father's company, doing what he loved. He was a man of invention, and he really loved tinkering with things, and he really loved creating machinery. And the Deering Harvester Company gained several patents through his inventions. And his brother Charles also operated in the Deering Harvester Company, but he was more on the personnel side and didn't really oversee the day-to-day operations. Now, James's brother Charles would later build another estate further south in what was even more country than James did. So really, the Deering Harvester Company was in a really bitter rivalry with the McCormick Harvester Company, and it had been going on for quite some time, many, many years. A lot of energy expended, a lot of money was expended on this really just sort of angst-ridden, sort of competitive environment. And eventually, through the skill of a very adept negotiator, the two companies decided to merge. And it actually was a very strategic merger because the Deerings held the machinery, the agricultural machinery dominance in the United States, and the McCormicks held it in Europe and other countries. And so these two companies formed what would become International Harvester. And it was not a pleasant merger, as I'm sure you can imagine. And though through that merger, IH held 85% of the harvester market and the agriculture and machinery market, the company was tanking because there was so much infighting and there was so much bitterness and so much energy being expended. As I'm sure we all know, bitterness is expensive. And it's not an easy thing to work with either. In 1906, the company reorganized again. James Deering then found himself out of a job and fabulously wealthy, which is not really a bad place to be, I think. However, we all have our cross to bear, and James's was pernicious anemia. This is a disease that now is very easily controlled through vitamin B12 shots, but at the time, there really was no understanding of what it was. And so he was facing, completely withdrawing from business or get buried early. So he decided to retire from his business. He decided to put all of that behind him, though he would hold the title of VP for another 10 years. And he began to spend more and more time out of Chicago and more time in New York, which is where he met Elsie DeWolf. And I'm sure I hear some murmurs of recognition here. I'm sure most of you know who Elsie DeWolf was. Very, very prominent interior decorator, and I believe actually the first female interior decorator in the United States. Through her, he met Paul Chalfin, who is the fabulously appointed gentleman here on the right, sporting this wonderful cummerbund and huge floppy hat. Chalfin was a professional associate of DeWolf's. He was very well educated. He was known for his skills in painting. He attended the Art Students League in New York, the École des Beaux-Arts in Paris. He also was a Rome Fellow, or he received the Rome Prize, and so he attended the American Academy in Rome for painting. We don't know why Elsie would have passed such a fabulous commission to Chalfin, who really didn't have that much background in decorating and so on, but we think that it was probably just because Deering approached her and said, I need somebody to help me buy stuff. And so Chalfin was the right man for the job. He did not know at that time what his commission would end up becoming. So he traveled with James Deering all over Europe, purchasing. He also took it upon himself to show Deering the wonders of European culture. Deering was very keen on it, but Chalfin was not. He actually found himself very irritated by Deering, who he said had the temperament and knowledge of a very small child who needed to be led around by the hand everywhere. So poor Chalfin did avail himself and took Deering to La Pietra, which is an estate outside of Florence, and it was owned at that time by Arthur Acton, who was in the process of restoring it. Arthur Acton had in his employ Diego Suarez here, who is this very dapper gentleman. Diego is he's dead now, a half Colombian, half Italian, an Italian-trained landscape architect. And he was studying in Florence at the time, and Acton had hired him to help him with the restoration of the gardens. So he said, here, Suarez, why don't you just take them around, show them the gardens that you've done, show them all the fabulousness that is Florence and Tuscany. And so he did. And Suarez and Chalfin struck up a friendship. And Chalfin said, well, I'm creating this place in Miami called Vizcaya. It's going to have some gardens. It's going to be really nice. If you ever find yourself in New York, look me up, and we can talk about gardens. Okay, great. So Suarez, probably a year or so later, was on his way back to Colombia for some family matters, had to route through New York and got stranded there because of strife that was happening in the country at the time. Walked into the lobby of the Ritz-Carlton and found Paul Chalfin and James Deering there having lunch. Chalfin was so taken aback that he said, let's go upstairs, I've got something to show you. Took him upstairs, showed him the plans, hired him on the spot. Said, I want you to create the gardens. Suarez was a young landscape architect. He had had some commissions in Italy, but he really hadn't had anything major yet. So of course he jumped at the chance, who wouldn't, and promptly created the gardens in New York, and realized later that it would be a horrible, horrible mistake. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the architect of the house, F. Burrell Hoffman, who was employed with Carrere and Hastings, which was a very prominent architectural firm at the time. He set off on his own, and he had set about creating his own architectural interpretation of a Renaissance villa. He combined many, many different He combined many different period styles into what he thought was the quintessential Italian Renaissance villa. Now, he and Diego had designed this fabulous formal and Italian French garden based upon what they knew and loved. And these are actual Suarez notes here, gardens that he had seen that he wanted to base Vizcaya upon. But really, the overriding vision was that of Chalfin's. Chalfin really took control of the aesthetics of the garden, and he described the Vizcaya to Architectural Digest as the appropriation, and I quote, the appropriation of sentiment with a preference for loose forms and theatric dispositions. Vizcaya was to invoke a partial evocation of the city of Tiepolo, careless, pompous, and gay, preoccupied with its final grandeurs, and even, while dying, living the realization of its chimerical dreams. That's very, very Chalfin. He was a very blousy, very ebullient fellow. And he was actually really kind of entranced with this idea of romantic decay. And I think that he got his inspiration from this book right here, On the Making of Gardens. It came out in 1909 by a burnt-out English aristocrat named Sir George Sitwell. He was very prominent in his native England, but found himself disenchanted, disenfranchised, and frankly burnt out. So he decided to take several years off, go to Italy, experience gardens, and so on. And though he was a rather crabby and irritable man, he did write very well and very eloquently, and he was very taken by the decay that was happening in Italian gardens at the time. Italy was in a very bad financially. Many of the old families had fallen away. Not many people had money, and many of these grand gardens were really falling into a sorry state. But he had the unique ability to look at these gardens, see them in their state of decay, and really find beauty from it, and kind of find this haunting quality. And that really entranced Chalfin, and he waxed poetic about the gardens in his writings to Deering many times. And that blousy and dimly recalled romance of these past gardens would be overlaid with Suarez's formal lines, which really, as we'll see later, created this sort of magical tension, that holds the gardens together and really kind of evokes this sort of mystical past that Chalfin was so entranced with. But going back to the actual design of the gardens, to accomplish anything impressive, we need a design. there was a massive problem with Suarez's design, and because he created it sight unseen in the studio at New York, he didn't account for many, many things. He was designing it with New York and Italy in mind. He didn't realize this until he had traveled 2 or 3 days by train to Miami, set foot on the site, and realized, oh my God, what have I done? He had created a garden that was quintessentially Italian, quintessentially formal Renaissance Italian. It was a series of terraces leading from the house envelope right here. We can see the east and south terrace right here, leading down to this large lagoon back here, which in this map is called the lake. However, what he didn't account for was the angle of the sun and the intensity of the sun. Now in Miami, we're about 100 miles north of the Tropic of Cancer. So we're fully subtropical. The sun angle is much, much higher in the sky. The sun is incredibly intense, especially during the summer. And what he found would happen was that this light would shine right into the bedrooms on the south side of the house and create a death ray that would literally boil everybody alive inside the house. That would never, ever, ever do. And it really was a deal breaker. So he went back to the drawing board and he really created something quite ingenious. He created this structure here, which we'll go into a little bit later. This is called the garden mound. And this is a structure that, interestingly, has the same size footprint as the house and the terraces. And it was built to block the sunlight from shining into the house. It's a 25-foot tall structure. On top of that structure, 4 quadrants were made. These quadrants were essentially rooftop gardens. They were created as large planters. They were filled with a custom mixed soil that Deering decided would go in there. He created the mix. And they later planted trees on top of this mound. And the idea was that it would block the sun from going into the house. But he also realized that there was no topography on the site. Those of you who have been to South Florida know that this is our topography right here. It's flat as a plywood board. The only topography we have is the landfill, which we call Mount Trashmore. That's it. We got nothing else. We got nothing else. He didn't account for any of that. So these formal European garden designs count on topography for enclosure of space and delineation of space. And so he set about creating his own. He created his own little artificial mountain here, and he created these 2 portions here, which he then called the statuary walks. These walks are raised up 4 feet above the central elevation of the gardens. That creates that feeling of enclosure that you need, and it also serves a dual purpose to protect the gardens from the wind and the salt spray coming in from the bay here. But that created another problem. We wonder why Vizcaya is a complicated place. That created another problem because his terracing now would not work. Because if he were to do that, this would be too low in elevation to really serve its purpose of blocking the sun. So he had to forego the terracing, and he really created this very ingenious French series of parterres right here. They're on a flat elevation, and they are created in what's called a pat droit, which is a goosefoot pattern. And what that allows you to do is actually look out here to a terminus, and you can sort of peek behind the mound and see what's behind it, right? See, it gives you kind of just a little taste of what's behind the mound, and it draws you out into the garden. So he really created kind of this ingenious theater as a result of those problems. But still, I ask to this day, what the hell were they thinking? To create an estate this massive, this complex, and because of Deering's inventiveness, remember, he was an inventor, very technologically complex, to create this in a frontier town like Miami, it's almost impossible. Miami was not the metropolis that it is today. Miami as a city is 350,000 people within the city limits. The metro area is 6.5 million. They didn't have that then. It was more like this. It was more of a wilderness with a small frontier town that was sort of cobbled together by people who were escaping their past. You know, people would run to Miami to escape the war, to escape their in-laws, to escape their children, and they would settle in Miami because at that time it was literally the end of the line. Flagler had not built his railroad all the way to the Keys yet. It stopped in Miami, and beyond that there was nothing. So Miami was a very, very small town. It was only about 10,000 people at that time. And almost none of them had the skills that these people needed to create this estate. So they sought about importing people from all over the place. They brought in skilled craftsmen from Scotland, England, Italy, Spain. They brought in laborers from the Caribbean. And as many as 1,000 people at a time were employed in the making of this estate. And it was a significant economic boost to that fledgling city of Miami. And very interestingly, some of the laborers, after they were finished, actually settled in Miami, and they've created some of the distinct, I should stop shaking this because it's forcing me along here. And they really created some of the distinct ethnic neighborhoods that we have in Miami, such as the South Grove, which is a neighborhood that is comprised mostly of people of Bahamian descent who were descendants of the laborers that built Vizcaya. So really, Vizcaya came in at the right time for Miami. It was just starting to be built. There were developments that were going in here and there. And Miami really was such a boost to that. And in 1916, they finally completed the house. The house took 4 years to build. And Deering arrived on his yacht, the Nepenthe, on December 24th to take possession of the house. So he came in on his yacht, docked right in front of the house, and with great fanfare and cannon salutes, his servants, or his assistants, dressed in gold-faced uniforms, performed the tarantella in front of the house to welcome him there. By this time, I can only imagine. I wish I was there. And our centennial is coming up in about a year and a half. And in one of our brainstorming meetings where everything was on the table, we actually considered reproducing the cannons and the tarantella. I think it would be great, especially if there were a lot of cocktails involved. But by that point, you know, Deering wasn't drinking anything. He couldn't. He was 57. He was a tiny little man by this point. His anemia had really taken hold, and he was in pretty ill health. It had advanced to the point where he was subject to bouts of depression, severe exhaustion. He would stay in bed weeks at a time. And, I mean, who would want to see this in good health? I certainly wouldn't. Deering didn't want to see it in poor health. So at this point, he really didn't spend that much time walking around the gardens. He spent most of his time fishing on his 2 yachts. Now, he also, though, did find the time to socialize. And, you know, like many men of his stature at that time, he had a number of famous and well-to-do friends, and he hosted them at Vizcaya, including William Jennings Bryan, who was also a neighbor, Marion Davies, Lillian Gish, who was so entranced with the gardens that she could not wait to get out in them, but very resentfully wrote to a friend that Deering forced her to stay in the central courtyard and watch a movie about bacteria. I'd like to think that she did have fun in the gardens later, but she didn't write about that. She just wrote about the bacteria. But he also hosted this man, John Singer Sargent. This is, we have copies, we don't have the originals, we have copies of a number of images that Sargent produced while he was at Vizcaya. And of course, they're all lovely, but this is by far my favorite. This is a rendition of the North Oval. which is just north of the house, and it's adjacent to one of the gardens I'll show you later. But he really was enamored of Vizcaya. He was not enamored of Charles Deering's, James's brother's house, which was about 30 miles south. In fact, he called it that guano factory that pushed you out of Miami. But he stayed at Vizcaya for quite some time. He was there about 6 months, and he painted a number of really beautiful watercolors of Vizcaya, which are now residing at the Museum of Art in Worcester, Massachusetts. So as the house and the garden construction continued, relationships with Chalfin became increasingly strained. Chalfin was a very special man. He was very opinionated. He had a very, very strong personality. He was openly gay at a time at which that could get you arrested and fined. He actually lived on a houseboat docked right outside Vizcaya called the Blue Dog, named after his dog. I can't remember the dog's name, but it was a chow, so it had a blue tongue. I thought about putting a photo of the yacht in here, but I didn't because of time consideration. It was 2 stories tall. It had window boxes on it with flowers going over it. It had drapes. It was wonderful. I can only imagine how much fun that boat was. But by the time the gardens were nearing their completion, relationships with Chalfin and his compatriots were really, really strained. Suarez has already been dispatched. Chalfin, for some reason, we're not quite sure why, demoted him to draftsman, to dispirited that he would quit, and he did. And F. Burrell Hoffman was on the outs as well. He grew tired of the repeated clashes with Chalfin, and the relationship became so bad that a letter of complaint was issued to Deering about it. By this point, of course, Deering's health was continuing to fail, and he no longer had the energy to deal with the drama. And so he said to Chalfin, "Fine, you do it." He gave Chalfin complete control of the remainder of this estate that needed completion. And so Chalfin promptly wiped the slate clean, got rid of everyone. However, he realized at that point, in a moment of illumination, that it might have been an egomaniacal thing to do, and he might have backed himself into a corner. So he hired a young architect named Phineas Paste to help him complete the architectural work. Some of you may have heard of Phineas Paste. He actually made his name working with Walter DeGarmo in South Florida, and those two were the primary men responsible for that Mediterranean revival aesthetic that we associate with older parts of Miami and Coral Gables. Those two men produced that. Vizcaya was their inspiration. However, Chalfin considered himself the architect of the estate. Even though he was not a trained architect, he was not a licensed architect. In a number of interviews, he claimed himself the architect of Vizcaya. However, in one interview, he was asked by a magazine who believed him to be an architect. Chalfin responded, quite out of character, that I am a decorator and I hope God will spare me from ever having to work with one. But that said, without Chalfin's insistent need for control, we probably would not have the mysticism, and we would not have the sort of emotional ebullience that we have in the gardens today. And we probably wouldn't have those teeny tiny little details that so characterize Vizcaya. I've been there 8 years, and I'm still noticing details that have eluded me up to this point, such as these wall pots here. These were all hand carved. All this rustication that you see here was all hand carved. Without Chalfin and his control, it doesn't seem likely that we would have that level of detail. So the gardens were finally completed in 1922, and by that point, Deering was in really poor health. I mean, he would spend 6 weeks in bed, and he was at Vizcaya year-round now. This was built as his winter home, but he was in such poor health he really couldn't travel very well. and we don't know how much he enjoyed the gardens that were made for him. There are some portions of the gardens that were made specifically for him, and we have every reason to believe that he used them. So it's likely he went out into the gardens, but he didn't venture very far, and he certainly did not go out here. This is the Casbah, and this is on one of the islands of the Lagoon Gardens. Now, the Lagoon Gardens are beyond the lake that I described to you guys very early on in the talk. And it was an over-the-top, and I mean over-the-top, representation of a tropical paradise. They really wanted to show their guests what the tropics really look like. They wanted to show them the Everglades, and they wanted to show them kind of the tropicalismo of South Florida, but they didn't want to show them the Everglades. You know, they didn't want to show them the gators and the mangroves and all of the weeds and all that stuff. They didn't, and the mosquitoes. No mosquitoes. So they created a fanciful representation. And each island in this, it was supposed to be very tropical and very New World, but each island had a distinct representation. So one island would feature the Casbah here, and another island would be a forest with a really simple Japanese bridge. And these islands were designed to be accessible by gondola, with a provided gondolier. You could also reach most of them by foot. You could reach some of them by car. They were intended to suggest foreign and distant lands that were sort of lost in the misty veil of time, much like each room of the house was intended to represent a distinct collection and a distinct ethnic representation, such as chinoiserie or French Revival or something like that, because they wanted to create this pastiche of antiquity, and they wanted to create a house that had the feeling that a family had lived there for several hundred years and had traveled all over the world collecting these antiquities. And the gardens were created in much the same way, especially these outer gardens. It was proposed by Chalfin that the central core gardens, which we'll see in a minute, were to show almost nothing tropical. They were to be very formal, very European in their appearance, even though they were using plants that would work in South Florida's climate. But that from the casino, which is where this photo was taken, the splendor of the palms of the Orient and the splendor of the South should first be discovered, according to Chalfin. From its steps of the casino, massive and elaborate Chinese and Moorish bridges, which you can sort of see the footings of right there, could be reached by walking to the Casbah, which is right here. Now, this property survived until the 1940s. Sadly, it's all gone except for the bridges and the Casbah. After Deering passed away, he inherited he left the estate to his nieces. And at that point, he died, right at the end of the Gilded Age, right at the beginning of the stock market crash and the Depression. So his family really did not have that much money, and it was a white elephant. They had this phenomenal estate in Miami that no one ever went to and no one really cared about. But his nieces had a lot of vision, and they recognized that James had at times thought about creating a museum out of Vizcaya, and in some of his writings to his family and to Chalfin, he does mention that he would like to leave this for people that go beyond him. And so they were really considerate of that. However, they had no money. So in order to raise the funds that they needed to keep the estate going, they had to begin to sell off portions of the estate, and sadly, this is one of them. This was sold to the Archdiocese of Miami in the 1940s, who then promptly filled it in and developed it. We have a hospital there now, so I guess that's good. But in 1925, these are the gardens at their peak. This was in 1925, and you can see they've really, really filled in. And right about this time, Deering died. And it seems that he followed the path of many great barons and many great estate owners of that time. It seems that they would expend massive amounts of energy and personal wealth and so on building these estates, and then once they were finished, they would drop dead. It certainly happened to Henry Flagler, and it happened to James Deering too. He died on a boat on his way back from Paris in 1925, which I think for him was probably quite fortunate, because thus begun the dark days of Vizcaya. In 1926, the Great Miami Hurricane hit. It was a Category 4 with winds of 150 miles an hour and went right over downtown Miami. Over 300 people were killed in the storm, and in today's dollars, the damage would total $165 billion. It was a phenomenally destructive storm. The city was almost wiped off the map. As you can see here, there was really almost nothing left. In terms of 2010 dollars, this storm was by far the costliest Atlantic hurricane in U.S. history. It even beat out Katrina by $50 billion. It gives you an idea of the magnitude. Miami didn't financially recover from this until the 1940s. Although that's one of the reasons that I bought the house that I did, because it was built in 1924. I know if it can survive that, it can survive the apocalypse. Vizcaya was no exception. The house survived relatively intact. It, like other structures in the gardens, was built with a very innovative construction technique for that time, reinforced poured concrete. On the first floor, the walls are 2.5 feet thick. So the estate did fairly well, though it did sustain some damage, but the gardens were almost obliterated. And his two nieces and another family member, Chauncey McCormick, brought Paul Chalfin back in 1934. There had been several hurricanes that had happened between 1926 and 1934, and so they brought Chalfin back to sort of get the gardens back on track, but also to simplify them, because they could no longer afford to maintain the gardens the way that they were. And the estate was maintained in kind of a basic condition until 1952, when it was finally sold to Dade County for $1 million, and all the contents of the house were donated. Today, the land and the contents of the house are worth about $500 million. So the county did really well, I think. But today, we are a public museum. We're accredited by the American Alliance of Museums, and we're an institutional member of the American Public Gardens Association. We welcome 200,000 visitors annually from all over the globe, and we've been featured in many films and TV shows. I don't know how many of you saw Iron Man 3. That's kind of our most recent claim to fame. We were the Mandarin's Mansion. So that was a lot of fun. But as you enter, you drive through the Rockland hammock, which Deering saved, which you see right here. And it's become the best remaining example of what is now a critically endangered ecosystem. The Rockland hammock is what we call an ecotonal ecosystem. So it grows in an area where two ecosystems kind of collide. A lot of Caribbean basin natives are endemic to this forest, and this is the only place that they grow. But we also have more temperate species such as live oaks. Many of these plants will fruit at a time that is advantageous for migrating birds. However, much to its detriment, it grows on a formation called the Miami Rock Ridge, which is a fossilized coral reef. And in some places, the elevation of that is 20 feet or more above sea level. And it's rock that you can build directly into. So this was the first to go when Miami was developed, and almost all of it's gone. And we've got the best example and probably the largest example left. It is a virgin forest. It's never been cut. It's never been disturbed. So the trees here are comparatively massive, such as this Jamaican dogwood right here. It's been there for quite some time. After I took this photo, I happened to look underneath it, because many of these trees are perched right on the rock, because they're growing right immediately on the rock, so they're perched and almost on stilts. I happened to look underneath it, and and pulled out an old soda bottle from the 19 teens. Somebody had taken a break there and chucked it under the tree, and here I am, find it 95 years later. And we have no less than 9 national champion trees on the property, such as this redberry stopper right here, which is the national champion, and it's over 400 years old. So as we continue, the landscape carves through the forest, and it directs you to the forecourt oval, which is a recently restored landscape, as you see here, that was intended to diminish the size of the house and direct your view right to the front door. Right up here, you can't really see it, but this is the piazza. And I'm not going to go back, but that was the area that you saw in one of the former slides. And you would drive your car down here, the valet would get you, and you would walk through here. That's if you were coming by car. This is the area that we welcome all of our visitors now. And as I said, we restored this area in early 2014, and we were able to bring in full-size trees. Like you see here, these were dug from other parts of the estate, and they were threatened by construction. So rather than remove the trees and destroy them, we root pruned them, delayed construction a little bit so we could use them in this landscape here. And South Florida is really amazing, I must say. For a tree such as this redberry stopper right here, which is about 100 years old, we root pruned it 6 weeks before we moved it. You can't do that here. We lifted it up by crane, brought it right in, instant landscape, and it's doing just fine. It's amazing. After a hurricane, you could have a 100-year-old live oak blow over. You just prop it up, fill around it, water it. It's fine. It's magic. It covers up your mistakes very, very quickly. This is the main entrance today, and this is where we welcome all our visitors, although this was originally intended to be the back door of Vizcaya. This is what it looked like during construction. They left the forest here. It was a very ingenious Vizcayan touch because it really kind of anchored the garden and the landscape and the house to the place. And it really kind of captured the spirit of the place, and it led an early visitor to proclaim that the house really is an elaborate garden pavilion in the midst of the wilderness rather than the 35,000 square foot palazzo that it actually is. This is on the north part of the garden. This is near the area where Sargent painted his watercolor. Deering liked flowers, which I find very, very ironic considering the formal European garden that was designed for him really featured nothing in the way of flowers. Talk about listening to your client. I don't think he was listened to very well. He was particularly fond of orchids, and he wanted an ample supply grown for display in the house. And thanks to the David A. Klein Foundation, we've been able to continue that, and our permanent orchid collection now numbers around 10,000 plants of all species and hybrids, and those are our permanent accessioned collections. And we rotate those out when they're in bloom. And he interestingly also insisted on orchids that were placed in the trees throughout the gardens for the enjoyment of the guests. And we take great pleasure in doing that as well. So if you are to come to Vizcaya during the right times of year, you'll see orchids growing all throughout the trees. However, in this formal landscape here, which we also have recently restored, this was originally called the North Lawn, but over the years it was where the orchids were displayed, and it's become such a popular spot for photography, for weddings, quinceañeras, what have you, that we really took great pains to kind of continue that tradition. And so we created stainless steel stems here, which allow you to see the orchids against the backdrop of this sort of dark green mantle, which is how the garden was originally intended. Now, very pragmatically, Mr. Deering wanted specific gardens devoted to specific kind of plants and specific kind of flowers. Chalfin would not have it. He would have none of it. So after some heated discussion, he and Deering decided to insert flowers into the parterres closest to the house, which are these right here. It's it's funny to read the correspondence between the two, because some of the times it was really, really over the top. And one of the most heated discussions that they had was about the types of flowers and the colors of flowers that they were going to put in the gardens. Deering liked gardenias, he liked hibiscus, and he liked poinsettias, and Chalfin didn't like any of those. And it was an ongoing battle, and some of the words that were used were quite choice and very, very funny, because Mr. Deering's tastes veered more toward the Victorian. He liked big flowers, he liked bright colors, he liked things in beds, he liked things planted in certain fashion, and Chalfin, on the other hand, his tastes were very, very European. However, he was very much like his protege, Elsie de Wolf, in that he only wanted flowers in the gardens that were the color of a summer luncheon. I don't know exactly what that means, but I can assure you it probably was not that. And if the gardens looked like that, I'd say I'd probably have to agree with Chalfin on this one. But that said, we do plan to bring flowers back to these parterres right here, and we plan to do that this next winter period. But we've taken great pains to actually kind of reduce the stiffness of the garden and create things that are more pretty. Deering liked things to be pretty, and he liked a lot of flowers, and he liked a lot of colors, and in some cases he actually was quite specific about the colors that he wanted. He really liked blues, whites, and yellows, and he particularly wanted them in front of the house. And this is the best photo I could find. So we've followed his lead, and we've planted a lot of blues and whites and yellows in front of the house. And this is the front door of Vizcaya. Unlike traditional houses, Vizcaya's front door, main entrance, faces southeast. It faces the bay, and the bay would be right over here, right off the picture. Vizcaya was modeled after a few different types of Italian vernacular architecture, but its most prominent feature is its facing side, which is this right here. This is the most impressive facade of the structure, and it's designed to give a lasting and imposing impression when approaching it from the water, very much in the style of the Veneto mansions that this portion of the estate was designed after. Now, if we're to turn around and we're to face the bay, we see one of the garden's most iconic and most recognizable features, the barge. And I see a few people nodding. Yeah, this is what most people remember. Originally it was called the Island, and this hulking piece of concrete was built at the edge of the original shoreline and then dug around once the foundations were completed. Its practical use is a breakwater. It was built to calm the waters of the bay so gondoliers could go back and forth and ferry guests back and forth from the mainland to the barge, because this also was designed as a party barge. It had fresh water run to it for the fountains. It had electricity run to it for lights. And here we can see it right before it was completed in 1917. It had a very elaborate summer house as well, and you can see some of the pots have been planted, and once this was completed and had a couple years on it, it was completely overgrown with foliage, much like the Isola Bella in Lago Maggiore in Italy. And Chalfin wanted this to be as over the top as it could possibly get. He wanted it to be as exuberant as the architecture of the Piazza San Marco in Venice. And we think that he did a really good job, because this is what most people remember when they come to the estate. And right here are the only two examples you have of breast reduction surgery in the entire history of the city of Miami. These were designed by Alexander Sterling Calder, and it was called The Trials and Tribulations of the Sea. The Italian craftsmen who were charged with carving these carved them very, very voluptuously, to the point where they would hang their hats on the nipples of the mermaids as they were carving other bits and pieces. Well, Deering came down, and he was a rather conservative man. He didn't like it at all. So he ordered that they be reduced and they be sort of toned down a little bit. And eventually he got the sculptor to agree, and so they were. But today, Really, this is all that remains. After successive hurricanes, it just became impossible to really keep it up as it was originally intended. And so we've just stabilized the structure to keep it as it is today. The garden mound is one of the other distinctive features in the gardens, and it was manufactured like the house using reinforced poured concrete. These live oaks here that you see here were brought in as full-size trees, and they were winched up to the top of the mound. They were rescued from construction sites all over Miami. Many of them are actually still alive today, as you can see here. And this is the casino. This is a ubiquitous part of French and Italian formal garden design. This is off the main axis, directly from the house. So if you were to stand here, you could look right into the tea room doors of the South Terrace. This was created for that visual stop, but it was also created for a place for Deering to retire to during his many social obligations. He was not a very social man. He was very awkward. He never married. And we don't have records of him having very many close friends, although he had a lot of associates. But men of that stature were required to host many social functions, and so he wanted a place that he could escape to and get away from it while everybody had their fun. Each room on each side features its own fireplace, and underneath there's another grotto that you can walk into, and there's a little parlor with a changing room and a bathroom and a spiral staircase, very narrow spiral staircase, that will take you up to the top here, which was used as a sun deck for guests. And directly off of that, we have some more. Around the mound, we see these intricate carvings here. These caryatides and telemoons were carved by Italian craftsmen out of blocks of local stone. All of this coral stone was quarried on site and then assembled and carved. All of this in here that looks like random pieces and broken pieces of coral stone, that's all cast cement. They had forms to recreate the appearance of the loose coral stone that is found all over Miami, but they wanted it to look a very specific way, so they cast every single piece by hand and assembled it piece by piece. Fountain was carved out of solid pieces of coral stone, and then up here, the seashell applique was harvested by Bahamian craftsmen from off the shore of Miami and in the Keys, and each shell was applied by hand in these designs. Very, very elaborate Baroque pattern and very, very labor intensive. Now, next to the garden mound, we have the fountain garden. This was originally called the Rose Garden because all of these beds right here were filled with roses, which were planted and promptly died. They really didn't know what they were doing. They really didn't. The gardens were masterfully crafted, but the plant material was horrific. They really had no idea what they were getting into, and there were many occasions where they would telegraph the director of the New York Botanical Garden and ask him for advice. Some of it was good, some of it was not so good. But after the roses died, they decided to call it the Fountain Garden after the Sutri Fountain right here. The Sutri Fountain was originally part of the town square of Bassano de Sutri, which was a small town about 8 miles outside of Rome. In the early 20th century, they got municipal water, so they had no need for the fountain, so a wealthy American came and bought it, which was James Deering. They disassembled it, numbered each piece, brought it back. When they brought it back, they realized it was too small for the scale of the garden. So what Paul Chalfin did was explode it. He actually took original pieces of the fountain, such as this here, and exploded it and put it on carved coral terraces here, and then created additional fountains here and here and here, so it actually met with the scale of the garden. And these topiaries here, these are Australian pine, Casuarina equisetifolia. Many of these are original to the garden. They were put there in tubs in 1917, and they still survive today. It's pretty amazing. These are incredibly tough plants. You can see how thick the trunks are. We recently had to repot them because someone had taken them off of their pedestals directly onto the ground. They rooted right into the ground. Some of them had roots that thick. Split the original pots wide open, so they're just sort of perched on top of the ground. They had no feeder roots whatsoever. It was all just this massive gnarled wood. So we had to dig them out by hand. We had to root prune them with a chainsaw. There was no other way. Really, there was no other way, and we had to hat rack them. We put them in the nursery. 6 months later, every single one except for one regrew, and we repotted them into these brand new pots that we purchased from Siebert and Rice through a grant from the Tiffany Foundation, and they're still thriving. It's amazing what these things will go through. Really, really is. As we walk through this amazing grotto filled with more of the cast pieces of coral, we come into the secret garden. And the secret garden was originally called the Orchid Garden, and it was modeled after the Giardino Segreto at the Villa Gambaraia, which is in a small town called Fiesole outside of Florence. It featured an elaborate trellis system that you sort of see here, that featured garlic vine that was supposed to shade the orchids. They planted orchids in all of these wall pockets right here, and they all died. They put more trellises up. They even put more trellises in here, planted more vines. They even, at great expense and at the last minute, created very heavy cypress doors that they could close to block the sea air from coming in. They died. So they gave up and said, well, we'll call it the secret garden. So for some reason, we're not entirely sure why, but these iron trellises were taken down. Thankfully, they did not take down the Samuel Yellen railing there. So really, the wall pockets have boiled ever since from the mid-1950s. But we find that we've actually been able to sort of adapt our horticulture. And they make perfect little pockets for many different types of cacti and succulents. There are many, many, many more amazing parts of the gardens that I'd love to show off, but I am at 8 o'clock, and so to keep this talk within an hour, which I have not done, I'll just have to say that you need to visit. But among the main gardens, there are several smaller gardens, such as the theater garden, as you see here, the maze garden, and my personal favorite, the marine garden. The marine garden, though now peripheral, was the critical link between the formal gardens and the lagoon gardens. And in it, there were 4 carved wisteria columns upon which 4 carved Gaston Lachet peacocks sat. Thankfully, those were taken down for conservation before a series of hurricanes in 2005 filled this garden with 5 feet of mud. But of all the gardens that I've shown you tonight, which make up the core gardens of Vizcaya, this one really captures the essence of Vizcaya. It is a pastiche of the old world and the new world. It's a stage set that transports the visitor to another fantastic place and time in history, which is exactly what Chalfin wanted the gardens to accomplish. So as we've seen, Vizcaya is a magical place filled with antiquities and follies. Fantastical ruin. It's a fantastical ruin that's perfectly overgrown with the exuberant South Florida foliage, and it's the result of a magical combination of money, unbridled ego, and creativity, and almost 100 years of weathering that has ultimately created the fantastical semi-ruined aesthetic that the gardens were always intended to have. Thank you for your time and attention. I think yes, I'm sure we have questions, and I'm happy to take as many as you guys have. No questions? Oh, yeah.
Where did Vizcaya come from? Do you know?
The name Vizcaya came from a mythical explorer called Vizcaíno. The theme of exploration, of discovery in the New World, was a really important theme that they wanted to carry throughout the estate. And you'll see one of the symbols of Vizcaya if you go there is the caravel. And so they proposed Vizcaíno because it sounds very Italian, but Deering nixed it because he thought it was too hard to say, and he'd be concerned that someone with the last name Vizcaíno would show up and then say the estate was named after them. So they changed it to Vizcaya, which actually is a Basque term that means elevated place. That still carries that theme of exploration. You had a question, ma'am?
Excuse me. Does Meisner have anything to do with
the question?
Relationship?
The question was if Meisner has any relationship to Vizcaya. Not that I'm aware of. The collections division might know more than I do about that, but I don't think so. Yeah.
Is there anything in the house today?
Oh, the house is completely full. We actually have one of the best collections of European furniture in the United States. It's a pretty significant collection. Very, very worth seeing.
What is the plant material that you use for the structure of the gardens that survives that climate and zones?
The question was, what was the plant material that we use for the structure of the gardens? I'm assuming you mean the parterres? Yeah, it's wax jasmine, Jasminum simplicifolium. Indestructible plant for South Florida. However, it grows very quickly. And we're trimming trimming the parterres during the summer every 3 weeks, and my guys have gotten it down from 3 days to a day and a half of solid trimming. It's a lot of work. We're looking at options that we can trim tighter and grow more slowly. That was actually their third choice. They used wax jasmine, and then they used some other really bizarre plant that I can't recall at the moment, and then they used orange jasmine, Morea. Sir? Ma'am? I can't see.
How did Vizcaya become a public museum? How did that come about?
Well, the nieces really had the vision. Deering had suggested it while he was still alive, and the nieces really had the vision to kind of make it come about. And they approached Dade County several times over the 30s and 40s about selling it to them to make a museum, because at that time Miami had no decorative arts museums. They didn't have an art museum of any kind. So that was the general idea, and they kept selling off pieces of the estate over time until the late 1940s, when they finally sold off that last portion to the Archdiocese, which was the most significant sale. And they went to Dade County and said, okay, this is it. If you don't purchase it now, we're going to sell it off and Vizcaya will be no more. So Dade County issued a series of municipal bonds and then purchased the estate. And it's still owned by Dade County today. I'm still a county employee. We are in the process of transitioning to a public-private partnership, though. Ma'am?
What about the music? We have a CD of Vizcaya's music in the gift shop.
Yes. I saw that tonight. I was pleasantly shocked. I thought the only place that sold those CDs was us. So I was really happy to see it. The Vizcaya CD is a recording from our pipe organ. It's a Welty and something. And it can either be played manually or it can be a player organ. And so the recording is from the original rolls that we have. It's a good CD.
How does it compare to the Flagler home?
The question was, how does it compare to the Flagler home? Well, we're smaller. I'd say as far as the elaborate, the elaborateness of the decor, and so on, I'd say we're probably equal. We're just the house is smaller. I think our gardens are much, much better.
Right, right.
Much better.
Let's say the Flagler Museum would have more art. Notable art.
I'm trying to remember the last time I was there. Yeah, I mean, the Flagler Museum does have a significant collection. It does have a significant furniture collection, but I don't think as much of that remains intact with the estate as we have with Vizcaya. I mean, the family did clear it out, right before they sold it. They took all the nice stuff that they wanted, but they left a significant part of the original furnishings. They left the furnishings and decor that was most integral to the feeling of the estate as a home. So they were really considerate about what they took. Yes, ma'am number 1, seated. And I'll get you next. You.
Is this all supported by county funds?
A portion of it. A portion of it. Our county funding comes from convention and development tax dollars. And that's fairly significant, don't get me wrong, but also a good portion comes from admission, from facility rentals, and then we now, for the first time in the history of the institution, have a fully staffed advancement department. So, our fundraising, I think, will be greatly enhanced by that. Our endowment right now is very, very small. Yes?
So what is your vision for the garden as far as, are you trying to maintain it at a certain time period, or are you trying to bring it up to modern sensibilities, or what are you?
It's a good question. Well, we have a period of interpretation that we need to adhere to. It's 1918 through 1926. And we have to adhere to that integrity in its intention. My vision for the gardens is to bring them back to their original splendor in 1925, but with current day horticulture practices, current day environmental considerations, and I want to take the horticultural collections beyond what they've been. When the estate was active, they were participating very extensively in horticultural trials and agricultural trials. They received a number of mango trees, avocado trees. They got a lot of really unique ornamentals from the USDA research station and David Fairchild. So there was a real intention of horticultural exploration and experimentation that I want to bring back. We're just starting to do that. We finally have a living collections program that we're adhering to, and we're starting to do some innovative horticultural practices now that the gardens are out of triage. So, I mean, I want it horticulturally, I want it to be one of the significant gardens in the United States, also historically as well. I said my goal when I started is I want people to round the corner and look at the gardens and burst into tears. In a good way. Yeah, I saw a hand, yeah.
What happened to his brother's house, his brother's home?
Charles Deering's home, he originally built a home in the Buena Vista neighborhood, which is where I live now. That was demolished pretty early on for development. But he built his house down in Cutler Bay, which is about probably 20 miles south. And that is still intact. It's also a Dade County property. And today it goes by the name of the Deering Estate. Yeah, it's a much humbler home than Vizcaya. Charles was a very, very different man than the people that James hired. Yes.
When you said you wanted to take it back to the essence of the gardens in 25, how would you characterize that period of gardening? What does that mean?
I want to take it back to the intricacy that was present in the horticulture of the gardens. I mean, the structures, they've obviously had 90 years to age, so they've accomplished what they were intended to do, look old. But the horticulture, and especially the formal gardening that we do, is not as tight as I would like it to be. The parterres are not as tight as they should be, and so on. And we don't have the floral capacity that we should yet. But the good news is that in addition to the gardening staff that I have, I've hired a formally trained horticulturist in the past 6 months, and I'm about to hire another. So we'll be able to actually begin to concentrate on the display horticulture, because that's kind of what's been lacking. And we'll be able to kind of tighten things up a little bit, because they're still a little bit floppy, in my opinion.
Does that tightness characterize gardening of that period, or just this particular garden, number one?
Mm-hmm.
Two, does one infer from that a more modern garden is necessarily looser, less formal, etc.?
Well, formal European gardens, and I use that term because the Vizcaya's gardens are predominantly Italian. There is a very distinct French influence to them. Formal European gardens are very tight. That they're characterized by that, and they're intended to be that way because it shows man's dominance over nature. And that's why in many of the formal European gardens of the Renaissance, you see these very intricate, very tightly maintained, very tightly clipped gardens surrounded by, the forest, the wilderness. That dynamic tension is intentional because it shows how man can dominate nature. So the formal European gardens, yes, that's characteristic. It doesn't necessarily mean that modern garden design is the antithesis of that. There's a lot of modern garden design out there that does borrow very heavily from formal European design. And I think kind of the neat thing about modern design is it has that ability to kind of pick and choose and kind of synthesize things in a way that you may not have seen before.
Is there a season? Is it the same season all year? Is it always hot and humid? Is there a certain time of year that's best to visit? And what about mosquitoes?
Mosquitoes. No, that's a good question. The question was about our seasons. Is it hot and humid and gross all year, or do we have seasons? And we actually do have seasons. We, believe it or not, have 4 seasons, although they're very subtle, and our seasons operate in reverse. We go winter, spring. Let me get this right. No, we go winter, fall, spring, summer. And during our rainy season is basically, usually it starts around mid-June. Usually the second week in June it starts, and it'll go through Thanksgiving. And then the dry season starts, the winter season, and that's when most people come down, and that's usually, like, I'd say Thanksgiving through probably Memorial Day. Memorial Day, it starts getting hot. Really, the only, in my opinion, I've only been there 8 years. The only 2 months that are really intolerable are August and September. Those are just miserable. But other than that, it's usually pretty temperate, and we're far enough south that we're in the trade winds. So once summer kicks in, then we usually will get a sea breeze that keeps it moderate. It still is very, very humid, but the temperature usually does not hit 90 degrees even during the summer.
And the mosquitoes.
Oh, and the mosquitoes. I don't know. As far as Vizcaya goes, we definitely do have mosquito season. We're surrounded on the east side by mangrove swamp, and that breeds a lot of mosquitoes. We generally don't have a big problem with them unless, we're in kind of a tepid weather situation where there's not a breeze. Sometimes we will kind of get, in a reverse pattern where we won't get the breeze off of the ocean. It'll be from the land. And that's when it gets really miserable because that air is then coming in off the Everglades. And that's when we get the mosquitoes. But usually it's not so bad. Just don't go into the Everglades during the summer. Or don't get out of your car, rather. Yeah.
What kind of wildlife do you have in the gardens?
Besides the people? The question was, what kind of wildlife do we have in the gardens? We have cats. We have museum cats. We take care of them. We give them their shots. We feed them, and so on and so forth. Because the visitors like them. They're friendly. We've got the standard stuff mostly. We have raccoons. We have a couple gray foxes. We have a red fox. We do get migratory birds, and I'm not a bird guy, but I've seen, what are they, the tanagers and some type of warbler. I want to say it's a mangrove warbler, but I don't think that's right. But we also have, screech owls and horned owls and things like that. We have macaws. We have the little green parrots, the conures. We have those. Let's see, South Miami has monkeys. We don't have those. And iguanas. We have a couple species of invasive lizards on the property, and then we have, a lot of the native lizards too, and a lot of snails. Yeah, sometimes they do. I'll take a couple more questions, and then I'll be outside as well. Ma'am?
The challenges of subtropical gardening, does this mean that your cultivars are pretty uniformly appropriate to that, or do you try to grow things outside of that range, and what are the challenges?
We do both. We have our standard stuff, that we need to use because it's replicable, and we need it for the consistency because of the formality of the garden. But we do a lot of experimentation as well. We've been working with the Montgomery Botanical Center. We're trialing a lot of tropical conifers. We also are a repository for endangered Caribbean plants, especially those of Haiti and the Dominican Republic. And we're keeping backups in the nursery, but we're trialing them out in the landscape in appropriate parts. So, for example, we're trialing a genus called Theophrastus, and it's Dominican Republic endemic. It's, I think, extirpated in Haiti, and so it's a critically endangered plant, and so we're trialing it in the forecourt oval because those four quadrants, while they're enclosed in a very formal, very strict landscape, inside those quadrants, it's very open and loose because it was forested. So that's an appropriate area where we can trial some of these plants or grow them in a horticultural setting so we can harvest the seed or propagation material. So we're finding that we have, within certain areas of the gardens, as long as we maintain that strict geometry, within that geometry we have a lot of room to experiment and to play. So again, now that we've gotten the gardens out of triage, we can begin to do that. One more question, and then I'll see you guys outside.
I just wondered if any of the family was involved with the home. I know it's part of the Dave organization at this point, but is any of the family still involved in any way? Or?
Some members of the family are. One descendant just donated a Anders Zorn portrait of James Deering that we now have in our permanent collections. Nancy McCormick, who is, I think she is the last direct descendant of the family, just gave us a sizable donation toward our endowment. And then there are some other members of the family that are still peripherally involved, but not on a day-to-day basis. And the gentleman right here, I'll take your question, and then we can head out.
Since what year has it been a museum?
It was opened in 1955 to the public as a decorative arts museum. And so the gardens, I wouldn't say they were left to rot, but they weren't considered decorative arts. So they really weren't a focus of the institution until our present director came in 2005. And and so there were several positions that he created. My position was one of those. And when I arrived, it was sad. It was really sad. Yeah, I was walking through the gardens when they flew me down, and I was in the fountain garden with who would then be my boss and my other boss, and they were showing us everything, and I'm thinking to myself, my God, this place is a dump. You know, and walking around and thought, well, the gardens are magnificent, even in the state that they were in. They are magnificent. So, you know, this is an opportunity that does not come along in one's career very often. Usually, you know, in public horticulture, you're maintaining someone else's legacy. You know, someone came before you and established a horticulture program, and you're maintaining that. It's extremely rare to come into an institution of this size and this significance and have the administration say, here, create the horticulture program. So I decided to take it, and 8 years later, I'm very glad. Very glad I did. So thank you again.